We've now had circuit overload on the election, and it's finished. But we now have a new president, President Obama, again for a second term, and he's going to face some new challenges in the next 4 years. We wanted to take a closer look at what those challenges might be, and what issues is the president going to face, how's he likely to handle them, and who's he likely to choose to handle them. So let's head to our D.C. Bureau, where Cliff May, the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, joins me to dig deeper into these issues. Now, Cliff, you're a former New York Times foreign correspondent. You've traveled and lived all over the world. You know everything from Russia to Afghanistan to China to the Middle East. And so I want to ask you, what do you think are the 5 biggest foreign policy issues that the new President Obama is going to face in the next term?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, I guess I would start with, is very simple and very straightforward. It's whether or not America is going to assume the responsibilities for leadership of the free world and global leadership more broadly. This gets into the whole issue of American exceptionalism. And I think American exceptionalism doesn't mean we're the greatest. It doesn't mean we want to be number one, but it does mean that somebody has to provide leadership. If we won't do it, who will? And I think the answer to that is the Iranians, the Chinese. Vladimir Putin will take on any role he can, the UN, but that would be a terrible, terrible mistake. Obama has not wanted us to lead from the front and play that role, but we should. Iran is the most important national security issue. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, this century will change in very, very terrible ways. And Iran is on the road to getting nuclear weapons. Obama has said that is not acceptable. Now we'll see whether he means it. I'm not entirely convinced, but I hope that he does. We have tremendous challenges with Syria, where 30,000 people have been killed. If Assad survives, that's a great victory for the jihadists in Tehran. He is their most important client. If he falls, that's consequential too. We have not defeated the Taliban in Afghanistan, even though we're leaving there. In Iraq, Taliban actually is resurgent, with a new tempo of attacks of about 140 a week now. And then we see what just happened in Libya, where in Benghazi we had our consulate and the annex overrun and Americans killed. That model will be replicated if we don't figure out how to address it.
Now, you talked about leadership, Iran, Syria, resurgent Taliban in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also Libya. You didn't talk about Asia. Give me your sense of where the world is going, or where the United States is going with Asia. Now, the president has said he wants to pivot towards Asia. Presumably that means ramping up the defense budget in the Air Force and naval areas. But what do you think is likely to happen, and what do you think is possible?
Right. Look, I think Asia is very important for the long run, but I think this idea of pivoting to Asia is like is moving away from the immediate problems we have to a problem we'd rather have, but not doing anything about the real crises of the moment. But China is a challenge, and China is an opportunity, and it's very important. If you want to be an important player in Asia, and we certainly should be in this century, we're going to need a very large Navy. And we're going to need a very strong military. And that's not what we're likely to get if the cuts that we're talking about come mostly out of the defense budget. The only way to play a role in Asia is to be able to project power into Asia. And again, that takes a Navy, that takes an Air Force, it takes aircraft carriers, and all the ships to back them up. So I think it's important, but I think right now the Islamist challenge, the jihadist challenge, the challenge of Iran, that should come first. That is critical. That is a crisis at this moment. And then but yes, we need to deal with China, and we need to maintain our very strong relations with Japan and with South Korea and with Taiwan and with others.
You talked about American exceptionalism. It's an issue that came up in the campaign, and everybody, of course, believes in American exceptionalism, but it's not clear what it means. You've recently written a column trying to define and sort of get your hands around what American exceptionalism means. Could you elaborate for us?
Yeah, first, I don't think everybody likes it or agrees with it. If you read places like The Nation magazine, The Huffington Post, you'll see a lot of people who are very offended and insulted by the idea. They don't like it. They think it's arrogant. They think it's hubristic, that sort of thing. I don't think it is. And then we've had recent articles by a reporter, good reporter, Scott Shane at the New York Times, Richard Cohn, columnist at The Washington Post, both objecting to the concept of American exceptionalism. Richard Cohen says it means, or it's supposed to mean, we are most beloved by God. I don't think it means that. Scott Shane said it means that we are exceptionally good in everything, and we want to be told that by our politicians. We don't want to hear about tough issues. I don't think it means that either. I think it means most of all that the modern democratic experiment, the idea of countries in which there is freedom, which there is a real commitment to liberty, rule of law, human rights, the idea that rights come not from a government but from a creator and nobody can take them from you. That was an American experiment that started in 1776. If we don't defend that, I don't think it continues to survive. Reagan said that freedom must be defended in every generation or it will be extinguished. And I worry that we're not willing to stand up for freedom in America and freedom internationally as well. When we have, I'll go back to 1989, when I think we really started on a road to a crisis, when the Ayatollah Khomeini said that Salman Rushdie had written a book that was offensive and that he should be killed. And instead of sending every Iranian diplomat home from every civilized country, what happened? That people said, well, Salman Rushdie's in some trouble now, he better get a bodyguard. We cannot allow people like Khomeini and many others to begin to restrict our freedom of expression, because if we do, all our freedoms will be in danger. America needs to lead in this battle. America is different from countries, not necessarily better, but different, needs to recognize that difference, appreciate it, and I think defend it.
But, you know, what would you say to people who say, look, America's war-weary. We don't have the money for a strong defense anymore. We've got deficit problems. We have budget problems. We have economic problems. Instead of building, you know, bridges in Afghanistan, let's repair bridges, you know, in Arkansas. So people who say, look, America needs to take a breather. America needs to come home for several years' time, focus at home, and not be worried about things like you're talking about, standing up for freedom of speech around the world.
Let's start by standing up for our own freedom of speech. Let's start by saying we are not going to allow our freedoms to be limited by anybody else in the world. We're going to understand that freedom of speech means some people may have to be offended by things that are said, and we're going to stand up for that right. Let's start with that. I also think, I'm not one for building a lot of bridges in Afghanistan. I think we cannot export democracy, but I do think we have a moral obligation to support those fighting for freedom in any country in the world. There are allies, and I don't think we should abandon them. Can't do the job for them, but yes, we should support our allies wherever we find them, people who really do believe in freedom and do see that as a core value. And I don't think we can take a break from the world. I know we're tired, but if we decide that we're just not going to fight for anything and all we're going to do is turn inward and build a better entitlement state, we're going to find a very hostile world very quickly. And the idea that we can be a fortress America, that our oceans can protect us, that's a nice idea. It's not realistic. We should have learned that on 9/11/01, and I don't think we have.
When you say support people who share our values, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's going to be different in different places. But I think, for example, right now, and what I think is one of the most underreported stories in the world, Christians are being persecuted and cleansed from one country after another in the broader Middle East. I think we should be talking about that, worrying about that, and trying to protect the Christian communities of Egypt, of Iraq, of Pakistan, and other minorities as well that are being persecuted and ethnically or religiously cleansed. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it's good for us or them if we simply turn our back and say that's their problem, it's not our problem. We're really much more worried about our 401ks and about how we're going to reform Medicare, which we're actually not doing either. I think at least to that extent we need to be involved. Now that may mean we cut off aid. It may mean we try to utilize the UN differently than it's used. It may mean a lot of different things, but at least we should be standing up for the weak, the powerless, and the people who are being persecuted and oppressed around the world.
Okay, well then let's go to Syria, which I think was your number 3. What should we be doing with Syria, and what do you think President Obama is likely to do?
Well, what I've thought for a long time is that we don't want boots on the ground there, and the good members of the Syrian opposition have never asked us for that. But I do think it would have been a useful idea, and still might be, to supply those with whom we share values, give them some funds and give them some weapons. Those who are doing the shooting will be calling the shots later. And the problem is that because we haven't done that, we've opened the doors for groups that are al-Qaeda linked, And they are getting more and more involved, and they're going to be more and more powerful. And I think that's a huge problem. We also haven't understood, I think, or the Obama administration hasn't, the strategic interest we have in seeing Iran damaged by Assad falling, since Assad is the most important client that Iran has in the Sunni and Arab world. So I think we should still be supporting those who are allied with us to see a reasonable outcome, and not a great outcome. I don't think you're going to see Syria turn into Switzerland or Costa Rica or anything like it, but it could at least not be a threat to itself and its neighbors. And the idea that we went into Libya because we were worried about a humanitarian crisis in Benghazi, of all places, and now we've sat back and done nothing while we've seen 30,000 people butchered, makes us look, I think, at the very least hypocritical. There are other things we could be doing, a no-fly zone to make it harder for people to get mowed down by Assad. But what happens in Syria we should understand, is consequential.
You're president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and your organization, really more than any other, has been at the forefront of talking about Iran's nuclear weapons program, monitoring the nuclear weapons program development, and talking about alternatives to either letting Iran get nuclear weapons or going to war over Iran's nuclear weapons to prevent them. And you've really been the leader in Washington to get a sanctions regime passed by the U.S. government, internationally at the UN. What do you think happens next? Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel in the last couple of days has come out with a much more militant tone, saying we might have to have some kind of preemptive action against Iran's nuclear weapons program. President Obama has said all options are on the table, and yet his military leaders, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, head of the CIA, have made their own trips to Israel saying, whoa, wait, don't do anything precipitous. What do you think happens next, and what timeline do you give it, Cliff?
Well, it's very hard to predict. I think he's trying to calculate two timelines. One is when the sanctions get to the point, and they haven't yet, they could be accelerated, where you really do break the back of the Iranian economy. That's the point at which the ruling elite might decide they have to do something else other than develop nuclear weapons. The other is the timeline as to when they actually have nuclear weapons. I'm afraid we see them getting nuclear weapons before the back of the Iranian economy breaks. So unless we push sanctions much, much harder, which we could do, there are ways to do it, it's not going to be enough. It'll be a day late and a dollar short. Netanyahu has real difficulties. He's got to, I think, now sit down, and he'll try, whether he'll succeed, with Obama and say, what are you going to do? And what can I do? And will you help me do what needs to be done? You should say to Obama, you said that it's unacceptable for Iran to get nuclear weapons. So now what is our plan? And we want to help, and we want your help to prevent that from happening. There are a lot of ways that Iran can and probably is running out the clock in terms of the centrifuges and the enrichment of uranium. I have to think that Netanyahu is very worried at this point, and I don't think we know what he's going to do. I'm not sure he knows what he's going to do yet.
Okay, let me ask you the two games that everybody in Washington loves to play. We're going to have a new Secretary of State, presumably in a second Obama term, and a new Secretary of Defense. Do you want to give put down any markers on who you think is going to be the new Secretary of State or Defense?
No, I'm not. I mean, I know the names that have come up.
Right.
But I can't tell you I have any insight into what President Obama's thinking is at this point in terms of who he really wants. And I think it'll be very interesting to see, because I think the real question here is, do we know, based on the past 4 years, what direction Obama wants to take on foreign policy? Or will he, now that he's been reelected, now that he won't face the electorate again, will he take a somewhat different approach to foreign policy and national security? And there was a lot of controversy when he told Russian President Medvedev that he'd have more flexibility after the election. I think that flexibility is not just in regard to the relations with Russia, which I don't think are very good or very successful. I think it's more generally, and I think we'll get some hint as to what direction he wants to go when we see who he picks for Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense.
Okay, well, thank you so much for spending this much time with us, Cliff. You're a guy who really has seen the bigger picture, the geostrategic picture of national security for a long time, and I really appreciate your taking the time to share that knowledge with us.
Always good to be with you.
Okay.